Hello to all of my wonderful listeners today. I am very excited and privileged today to sit down with not one, but two phenomenal people who are doing some amazing work in the field of compassion. Today, I'm going to be meeting with John Makransky, Ph.D., who has been the professor of Buddhism and comparative theology at Boston College, senior academic advisor for the Buddhist Studies Center at Rangyung Yeshe Institute in Nepal, president of the Society of Buddhist Christian Studies, and contemplative fellow of the Mind and Life Institute. In 2000, John was ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, and since then has taught meditations of innate compassion and wisdom to modern Buddhists, those of other faiths, and those in caring professions. For that, John developed the Sustainable Compassion Training Model. John is going to be joined by Paul Condon, PhD. Paul is an associate professor of psychology at Southern Oregon University and a research fellow at the Mind and Life Institute. He has also served as a visiting lecturer at Rangyung Yeshe Institute. His work has appeared in leading psychology journals and Buddhist magazines, as well as the New York Times and other major publications. Paul is co-developer of the Sustainable Compassion Training Model, and he teaches the Tibetan Buddhist meditation for multi-faith and secular practitioners. Today, I am so excited to welcome them. They're going to be talking a little bit about their latest book, How Compassion Works, and telling us how their worlds of faith, spirituality, attachment theory have all collided and come together. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Attachment Theory in Action podcast. I'm really excited to have both Paul and John here with me today. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Thanks for having us.
We are going to be talking about your book, How Compassion Works. We're going to kind of take a deep dive into that. But my regular listeners know I always like to start the podcast with the same question. And I know that your stories are kind of combined, so I'm going to let you guys decide where to begin. But just tell us a bit about your story. How did you end up in this field of working in attachment, cognitive science, with the Buddhism? Like, tell us a bit about your journey into this, anything from your early life or early careers that really drove you into this work.
Paul, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I was going to say we should flip a coin or something, but yeah, I can say a little bit about some early experiences for me that were influential. I think it starts for me, I think, in my adolescent years. There were some people in my life who had a contemplative practice, and I think I just appreciated their way of being, the qualities of their behavior and the way they were. I think it was a sort of comfortable kind of space to be around, and I appreciated it. And then as a college student, I was able to spend some time studying ideas related to meditation and Buddhism and psychology, as well as attachment theory. And I took a course with a professor who explicitly taught at the intersection of attachment theory and meditation. And that course was really the most memorable experience of my college education. And attachment theory was one of the perspectives in psychology that seemed to have the most depth, or the most power to explain human behavior. It wasn't just a kind of one way of explaining a particular study or a particular finding, but it was really a comprehensive view that explained human behavior from infancy through the lifespan. And then while studying those ideas, I came across some work by some people who were looking at how attachment experiences could inform compassion, and it could inform how compassion was enhanced or how compassion was perhaps decreasing in certain people. And the idea that when people feel a sense of safety or security, that their ability to engage in compassion increases was inspiring. And eventually, I ended up meeting John at a conference, and John was teaching about some ideas that had some synergy with that idea that having a basic sense of security was important for the ability to extend compassion. So then that's where John and I met and started engaging in these conversations. So John, I'll flip it over to you.
Oh, sure. Well, I came into all this primarily through Buddhism and have been practicing and studying Buddhism for the past 40 some years. And at the conference that Paul just mentioned, where we met, actually, I was teaching some practices that I had adapted from Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism and many other forms of Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia and Tibet and Himalayas give tremendous emphasis to devotional practices. Often they're referred to by that name, meaning the sense and the experience that you and your whole world are held in a field of absolute unconditional warmth, love, acceptance, compassion, wisdom, discernment, resonance, responsiveness, and creative activity, that you're held in that field by all those who have awakened or become enlightened before you. That's part of the deep structure of Tibetan Buddhism. And it had struck me that I'd been practicing Buddhism for all these decades, and as part of both within Asia and within the West, I was familiar with many Western Dharma or Buddhist practice centers, and also ways that meditations of mindfulness and love and compassion and so forth were being adapted from Buddhist traditions into the West. I was aware of that and had a lot of exposure to that. And one thing that really troubled me about all that is the tendency among Westerners who were adapting meditation traditions from Buddhism and other Asian traditions into the West to simply delete the foundational function that devotional practice serves in all those traditions, to just ignore it and to retranslate all of the contemplative practices, including mindfulness, into just some form of self-help. You just are here an autonomous sense of self, and you just take up a technique and you learn to do it by yourself, of yourself. And that's somehow supposed to take you into really deep wisdom and very deep compassion for beings. The problem is, it's very hard to come into a very stable, kind of grounded experience of compassion for other beings if you have not had a stable experience of what it feels like to be held in love and compassion. And that brings us right into the pattern of attachment theory. So then I became aware, even though I was primarily coming at it from Buddhist theory and practice, contemplative practice, I became aware of attachment theory through writings of social psychologists. And it just struck me. Then I started reading about what's called attachment priming, that repeated exposure to just thinking of a loving figure in your life, for example, or even the word love, and it could actually shift your attachment pattern temporarily, but significantly. And so it struck me, well, that's actually what all these meditation traditions have been doing. I mean, with their devotional practices, Asian Buddhists and also Hindus and others, I mean, throughout this is across religious traditions, but I'm coming primarily from Buddhism, but I know it's across them as well. It's something analogous to attachment priming, but it's more like an infinite secure base of unconditional love, compassion, support, care, wisdom that you experience, that you are held in. What an amazing power of secure base upon which then to allow that to extend itself to hold others, even many others, even more and more unconditionally and all inclusively. So that tremendous power coming from the devotional foundations, really, of these religious spiritual traditions had been deleted largely in the coming of meditation into the West. That really troubled me. And I presented on that at a conference that Paul was at. And after that, we came into pretty deep dialogue about all this.
Okay, so you both of you have brought up some fantastic points that I want us to dive into a little bit more. But and I haven't prepped the two of you for this, but I have a personal question that I've just thought of that I think is interesting to me at least. And first of all, really, this is geared towards John, so forgive me, Paul, but I'm curious how you got interested and into the practice of the Buddhists originally. Like, was there a point in your life where you realized it was something that you wanted to engage in, and or was there anything driving that?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's pretty straightforward. I'll just share two main things about it. One is my earliest memory of contact with Buddhist tradition was in sixth grade class. And we were doing a social studies section in sixth grade on cultures of Asia, focusing on India and then China. And I love that whole section of the course. But we came one day, we were this very small section of this paperback book on everything about Indian history and culture. And one day, then our sixth grade teacher introduced story about the Buddha. And he said, now the Buddha was someone who came to some great, what's called an enlightenment experience, in which he realized or came to a realization such that even if he were to lose everything, he lost his home, he lost his family, he lost all his possessions, he lost everything dear to him. Even if he were to lose everything, he would still be abiding in unshakable serenity, well-being, and deep equanimity. So my sixth grade teacher was not an expert on Buddhism, but that communicated something. He communicated something through that, and it absolutely caught me. And I remember in that moment in that sixth grade class, I looked around like I felt like lightning had struck. Like, what? Is that possible for a human being? And if so, why are we going on to talk about other things, about Indian culture? We should be right here with this. What do we do with that? So that was the first thing. And then perhaps related to that, but I forgot about that. But then from late middle school into high school and then college, I became really interested in psychology. And I started reading Freud when I was in the ninth grade because I was just fascinated by kind of the inchoate, often irrational ways that we're all reacting to everything. Like middle school is basically that kind of cauldron of irrational, constant reactivity to each other. I also found parts of my family life and the larger community of family lives I was embedded in, just kind of endless emotional reaction to each other. It all seems to be driven by something we're not even conscious of beneath our surface consciousness. So that drove me into Freud. I started reading him in ninth grade and then all into high school, and then Carl Jung and then other psychologists, and also the possibility that there could be some great positive capacity in the human being, like that story I heard from sixth grade about the Buddha. What are the models of the human mind for the possibility of really profound human transformation and become aware of the unconscious forces driving us? So then in college, I got really into psychology, and eventually through that, I started taking courses on Asian philosophy and religion with a focus on Asian psychology. And eventually that led to a course on Buddhism. And as soon as I hit Buddhism, then I remembered this is it. This is what I was looking for. And then I had to get to Asia to be able to study and practice with Buddhists and really learn what this was and what's possible with it. And that took me to Asia first in the Peace Corps, and then for years to follow, practicing and studying with communities back and forth between Asia and the West.
Well, thank you for humoring me with my question. And Paul, I want to reflect it to you too. When you first started speaking, you described you really found an attraction in that contemplative uh, way of being. Was there anything that you felt was driving you towards like that attraction to it? Like what was it about it that really spoke to you that you were like, okay, this is something that I need to be engaging in my life?
Yeah, I think, and I reflect back on the experience in that class that I mentioned that got into attachment theory and meditative traditions. I mean, I had been spending some time studying psychological perspectives on flourishing and being, like positive or scientific kind of perspectives, but there was something about the contemplative experience and then in dialogue with attachment theory that made it come alive in a more experiential and embodied way. And I remember that was the first time I tried meditation. And I remember meditation practices of just sitting and being with a candle, like kind of a visual meditation on the experience of the candle, and realizing through that experience that it really matter how the meditation went. It didn't matter if there was a sense of boredom or a sense of like not really feeling accomplished. Like still there was something about the experience that was peaceful and calming in an embodied way. And that felt like that kind of learning that we can experience a calm or peaceful, regardless of sort of what thoughts or experiences are going through the mind, felt really important. And I didn't really have the framework to articulate it or talk about it, but there was something about that I wanted to keep learning and keep studying. I had also read some work by the Dalai Lama and his conversations with psychologists and psychiatrists, and the emphasis on compassion as an approach to well-being and happiness, and that felt something about that felt important, and I was drawn to pursue that line of thought further. So then when I went to grad school, I was pursuing my PhD as a social psychologist, and I wanted to study compassion and how to increase compassion from a social psychology point of view. And at the time, the research on meditation was much more focused on how meditation can improve our health, like our physical health, and how it affects the brain in terms of being able to sustain attention or to be able to engage in various kinds of cognitive tasks to improve creativity or cognitive flexibility. And all of that is important, but I was really curious, like, what's the effect of meditation on people's interpersonal outcomes, or like how we treat each other, how do we interact with each other from the social psychology kind of perspective. And so as a graduate student, I started to engage in that kind of research, and that was my first first professional effort to try to study meditation. And we found some evidence that,
Go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was just to finish up that point, we found some evidence that compassion training and mindfulness training actually does increase people's willingness to help each other. So it was at the time, it was an exciting result.
I think the reason that both of you have kind of touched on this, in my mind, my reason for questioning is I feel that meditation in general, and this is gonna be a very loose generalization. I think to a lot of people seems kind of far out of reach. Like this is something that I can't achieve, that it's going to take a long time for me to get there. I don't even know if I believe that this is possible, right? John, you mentioned the sense of enlightenment, and just I think many people are like, this is a concept that's too out there for me to wrap my head around, and so it's not achievable. And I think both of your journeys reflects a little bit of that it's taken, this is a long journey that you've both been on. It's not something that suddenly happened overnight that you have this realization as such, or maybe you had the thought, but it takes a long journey to get to a point where it's all fully embraced. and realize. And so I think that that scares a lot of people away, you know, and I think that that's why that the whole self-care piece has just taken on in terms of uh like people can grasp onto that, right? Because it's easy, because it's very surface level. I don't have to get too deep into myself and my stuff. And it doesn't feel uncomfortable, right? To just do it for a little bit. And so I completely agree with what you guys have said in terms of it being this, it's kind of a band-aid. It's become a band-aid approach for people to just meditate for a little bit. But what you're getting at is there's just this, if you can fully commit to it, this deeper healing journey that you can go on, this deeper work that you can do to become more compassionate to yourself and then to others. Um, Go ahead.
Well, I think if just living life the way we're all in the habit of doing, in our habitual ways of reacting to things the way we're used to habitually reacting to everything, and conditioned to do so socially as well, if that worked real well for us, then I think it would be fine to just stick with that mainly, and maybe just touch in a little bit on something that makes us feel a little bit more peaceful for just a little while. That would be good enough. But what if our usual ways of reacting are not working so well?
Mm-hmm.
Both in our individual lives, in relation to others all around us, relation to our work and those we work with, relation to our family life, and also more macrocosmically, in terms of, well, how well of our habitual habits as individuals and communities and nations, how well have they been contributing to this world, what we're seeing now in this world? How well do we see each other? How well do we really know what we're all capable of? How much do we see in each other? Or are we mainly just reacting to our familiar thoughts and labels and images of each other and mistaking them for each other? I think the latter is, we're doing much more of that than we're conscious of. So I actually make an argument that it's worth some serious investigation into what's available beyond just our habits of reaction and our habits of trying to hold together our comfort for a little while until we have to say goodbye to all of it anyway, quite soon, when we die and those close to us die. Why not inquire more deeply than that into what am I really meant to know here? What's really possible for me as a human being and for others? And what do I need to do to bring out that possibility? And that can take us into different forms of practice, including contemplative practice or meditation practice, but then it's more than a hobby. So those are the thoughts that your question raised for me.
Paul, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I understand all of those kinds of like concerns or narratives that people might have about meditation, or like kind of a thought that it would take a really long time for it to really take hold. But also I've seen a number of settings where it does kind of hit people in a very sudden way, kind of like very similar to John's story of reading it about enlightenment as a sixth grader and having some kind of immediate connection with that. So for example, with the class that I described as an undergraduate, one of the first things we did was we each individually wrote down some kind of inner thought that we had to listen to throughout the day, or something that we wished we didn't have to listen to throughout the day. And the professor had everybody submit their cards anonymously, and then he went around and read them, and there were examples or inner voices like never good enough, I'll never amount to anything, or, these various kind of inner criticisms that we all tend to experience. And it was a very short exercise, but just like suddenly, I think in the classroom, there was a sense that we're not these thoughts that we're having. This is something that everybody's experiencing to some extent. And in that shared experience, we were suddenly kind of freed from being identified with those thoughts. And we were then relating to each other in a different way. I could feel that in the room. It was very palpable. And that was just, a 10, 15-minute exercise we did at the beginning of class. And then we spent the rest of the term kind of understanding and unpacking it more. And similarly, now as a professor, when I teach courses to undergrads in a psychology program, we'll do meditations, very brief way, like 5-minute meditations in the classroom. And I have students who will say those things like, I don't feel like I can do meditation, or I've tried and it's never worked well for me. So they have those preconceptions. But then we'll do a brief meditation and then process it as a group a bit. And they share from their experience, see they're not the only ones who have certain experiences, but there's some sort of shared connection. They're then suddenly freed from that difficulty as if it's not their own. And there's something about that shared experience that's very powerful. And it may not be that way for every single person in the room, but for the majority, it seems to be that way. And then that's an experience they can then be grounded in or come back to.
Yeah, that's very nice summary of that. And I find that too, that there are ways of introducing, there's so many different kinds of contemplative practice and meditation, and there are different perspectives on how they function and how they work. But the particular kind of tradition that Paul and I most often draw from, that is from within Buddhism, and of course then Paul and I also to some extent bring that into dialogue with areas of psychology and cognitive science. But in terms of what we're drawing from Buddhism, we're drawing from a kind of a sense of things that there's actually a tremendous underlying capacity within the human being that's ready to surface at any moment if we just entered into, even for a moment, into a process that begins to interrupt what is obstructing that inner potential, interrupt what's holding it back in a way that brings it forward. Like even just something as simple as the sound of a bell can suddenly interrupt the usual habits of mind and bring some peace almost immediately. And just the story that Paul just told, the moment of suddenly the classroom, when asked about the critical voices that they frequently experience, and they begin to share them with each other in the classroom, suddenly the tendency to just identify with that critical voice just got interrupted by hearing it from others. And the class was thrown into a state of empathy for each other. Paul was describing. That's profound. But that capacity to be interrupted and to then drop into a state of groundedness that has powers of compassion and connection, that capacity is always here. Just need to know how to let it come forth. And that's what various practices can do.
The words that are floating around in my head right now are hope and healing. When I'm, thinking about the treatment or the healing, I would prefer to call it a healing journey that many individuals with an insecure attachment pattern may go on. This to me is just the immense possibility that could come from doing this kind of work for those individuals, I think is huge. And I've spoken to, a few people with lived experience who are kind of combining this, doing this whole body approach. It's not just a talk therapy. It's this combination and really getting to the root of those inner voices. And Paul, I'm gonna mess this up, but you mentioned about that we all have the capacity within us, right? But it's the barriers that come up, those voices that Paul was talking about, that those are some of the barriers that come up, particularly for those with an insecure attachment pattern that stops them from really being their true self, their most truest, authentic self that was always there, that has been impacted by external pieces. So I think when I think about the work that you both are doing and this and your book, that not only for professionals who are trying to support others and working on their own ability and capacity to hold and be compassionate for others, but for those who are in the healing process too. Compassion for themselves to begin with, and then the hope is then that they can then spread to others. So let's dive into the book a little bit, because I know we've been chatting a lot around it, but let's talk a little bit about we've kind of talked about how things have collided, but talk a little bit more about the three modes in the book that you've identified and some of I suppose the work that's described in the book.
So maybe I could begin with that.
Yep, that would be great.
Let me just back up one step from these three modes of practice that we introduce in the book. And I'll just very briefly mention some basic understandings coming from Buddhism that underlie what then becomes these three modes of practice. But even though I introduce some concepts from Buddhism, as we explain in the book, the broad concepts we're drawing from, we can find parallels in other spiritual contemplative traditions. So this is certainly not just for Buddhists, but just to track where we're coming from a bit. One basic understanding from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective that we're drawing from is that we all possess a tremendous positive innate potential in the very ground of our experience, which is often called our Buddha nature, or the deep nature of mind. And that's not just a vague thing, it's understood and experienced as a basic space of our being, or emptiness, or basic space of our being, that's undivided from vast capacities of awareness, warmth, unconditional love, compassion, and wisdom. And these remarkable innate capacities are always available below our surface consciousness, in the ground of our experience, but are often hidden by our limiting habits of thought and reaction. So in the book, what we do is we explore ways derived from Tibetan Buddhism but also parallel similar patterns in other traditions. So people from any background could actually recognize this pattern and map themselves into it. Ways to become increasingly receptive and transparent to these innate capacities. And we do that through sense experience, through relational fields of loving connection, by settling directly into the source of those positive capacities in the depth of our awareness. And then from that depth, we can learn to sense others more in their depth and to hold them in the same unconditional loving qualities. So that what I just said becomes the three modes of meditation practice that we introduce in the book: receptive mode, deepening mode, and inclusive mode. In the receptive mode, we bring to mind a relational field of loving connection, a field of care or refuge. Bringing to mind your recollection of a caring moment that makes you happy to recall, or a benefactor in your life, someone that you feel genuinely grateful has been in your life or world, or a spiritual field that you experience as holding you and your whole world in unconditional care and love and wisdom. So the first mode, this receptive mode, is becoming receptive to unconditional qualities of love, compassion, and wisdom from the depth of our awareness with the help of a field of care like that, which parallels what's actually done in the diverse spiritual traditions. Bring to mind a field of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or communion of saints, or the prophets, or a deep benefactor, or your profound rabbi, or however it is for you. So that leads into the deepening mode from receptive mode, the connecting with unconditional qualities from the depth of our awareness then we let those loving qualities help the mind to settle into their source in that depth or ground of our experience, the pervasive openness, the clarity and warmth in the ground of our experience, the depth of our being, our Buddha nature. And then in the third mode, inclusive mode, we come from that depth of being to know and sense others in their depth, prior to and beyond all of our habits of reaction to our limiting images of each other. More fundamental than that, sensing each other from our own depth into their depth, their deep capacity and the openness and the ground of their being, their profound dignity and positive capacity, and then to include them all in the same unconditional qualities of openness, warmth, and compassion. We call that inclusive mode. So now you're including others and many others in the powers of these unconditional qualities coming from the depth of your being. So those are the three modes: becoming receptive to those qualities from your depth, letting them help you settle into that depth and become familiar with it, begin to reunify with it. And then from that depth, now you can begin to sense others more in their depth, not just your habits of thought about them, the depth of their being, their deep dignity, worth, capacity. And you begin to relate to them from your depth to their depth, and that's inclusive mode. So in the book, we adapt that practice from Tibetan Buddhism with some assistance and from modern psychology and cognitive science, and try to make that accessible both for modern Buddhist practitioners, but also for people of all backgrounds and faiths who really are seeking a way to cultivate much more unconditional and much more inclusive love and compassion, more stable.
I'm glad that you highlighted that this is really for anyone of any faith, and for it to really, for them to, you use the same concept in whichever faith you practice, and so on. The things that I'm thinking about is really my mind's thinking about so many different things, because this work is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. I'm thinking about the word for me that's coming up is discomfort. While I think this work is fantastic, I think about the discomfort for some people, in terms of this work begins with us, right? It requires I wrote in our our first discussion that the three of us had, that we are really going from external to inner to deepest self, right? We're on this journey. But it still begins with us. And I think so many people find that so difficult, that we have to work to address our stuff before we can get even deeper and then apply that externally. And I think so many helpers in the field, in the psychology field, in the social work field, the roles where compassion is very prominent, struggle because we don't want to go there with our own stuff. We just want to help other people. But what you're describing is we have to go there first before, or if we want to have more compassion for others. Is that accurate, or am I wrong in that thinking?
I'll say one thing real quick, and then I'm sure Paul will have some really good things to say. But real quick, one would be, we can do both. It doesn't have to be one exclusively first before we can even touch in on the other. We can do both. But the problem is, if all we do is focus on helping others, which of course is wonderful, but if that's all we're doing, and we haven't learned how to be present in a deeply accepting, loving, compassionate way toward all of our own feelings and reactions, if we don't know how to do that, then we cannot be profoundly, compassionately present to others. We cannot. We can try to be. We can believe we should be. We can want to be. We can keep working and trying to help. But we cannot be that kind of secure base for others because we don't have it in ourselves. So this direction of learning is one in which we can be doing both inner exploration and development and outer working to help benefit our world. We can be doing both. We cannot benefit the world from a stable place unless we learn also how to establish that within ourselves. And that's what our work is really focuses on.
Yeah, that's a great point. I really like that. I think what you're describing about the discomfort, Kirsty, is really important, and this is also why attachment theory is so helpful. So we know from the kind of vocabularies and perspectives within attachment theory that our various strategies or habits to control sources of care have been rooted in our early experiences. So we maybe have learned ways of being in connection with other people that are more or less functional based on early experience are actually attempts to keep us safe in relationships. So we might approach relationships or connections with other people with a certain kind of protectiveness or a certain kind of anxiety, various kinds of strategies based on what we've experienced throughout our life. And attachment theory helps us to see that. And it also helps us to see how the healing journey or the sort of contemplative journey that we're describing in the book, there might be some discomfort because it involves, to an extent, challenging those strategies that have felt comfortable or safe throughout our life. We're learning to see how our thoughts and our ways of seeing the world might be not entirely true, and that can be uncomfortable to see. But what we try to do, what we're doing with the receptive mode that John was describing, is helping people in whatever way works best for them to find moments in their life in which they do feel a sense of ease or enjoyment or peace, just in some simple way that they can repeatedly reconnect with, come back to, so that that sense of safety and security is strengthened and that we can learn to trust it more and more. There's another connection that I find really inspiring and kind of helpful here is that John and I talk about the importance of having a kind of a benefactor or a kind of a model of someone who's embodying the possibility, and that provides a kind of potential that we can hang on to. So that might be somebody in the role of a teacher or a benefactor of some kind or a spiritual benefactor of some kind. In psychology and research on children, there was a study that looked at infants' capacity for vision and depth perception. And this study is called the visual cliff paradigm. Have you ever heard of that, Kirsty?
I haven't, but
So
now I have to look it up.
yeah. So in this visual cliff study, what researchers did is they put babies on a table, and the table had a checkered cloth covering half of it, but then the other half was a glass table. So the babies would walk or crawl halfway and they would stop because they perceived it as a drop off or like a cliff. And so they would stop. And this was first taken as evidence that babies could perceive depth. And then researchers took it a step further and said, well, what happens if there is a caring figure, the baby's mother, for example, on the other end of the table? And what they discovered is that the baby would take cues from their mother in terms of how to respond. So if the mother expressed fear or a kind of uncertainty, the babies would stop at the edge where the cloth and the glass meet. But if the mother expressed a kind of interest or curiosity or joy or like encouragement, then babies would crawl past the cloth onto the glass plane with no fear. And I think this is a really nice metaphor for what we're talking about with this process of what does it take to let go of our attachment in terms of the Buddhist attachment or clinging to our internal voices and internal thoughts and safety strategies. What does it take to let go of those and wade into this, what John's describing as the deepening mode or the ground of our awareness that is prior to our thoughts and constructed reactions? And so when we're in a, like I described with that example of students in the classroom or a social context where we're supportive of others, when there is a context where it feels more safe to relax our clingings and patterns and attachment strategies, that can give us some support for letting go and sort of going deeper into that process and engaging with that discomfort. We need something, some kind of experience of support and safety to enable that, I think.
It's so interesting that you brought that up because I just recorded with another guest, and he has some lived experience, and he described how th throughout the years of his recovery and journey, there were two people who would not allow him to, for want of a better word, wallow in the experiences that he had had, and they, to me, were what you've just described, this kind of beacon of hope. And it wasn't a, hey, you can do this. It was a, no, I'm not going to let you keep believing that about yourself kind of thing. And I'm not buying it, were his words. These people just weren't buying my kind of victim narrative, or that his experiences were what was gonna define him. And I think the hope that I see in the approach that you're describing, and using Buddhist techniques and approaches, is that there's hope for people who don't have physical people in their life saying those things, that there is a greater power in the world, but also within themselves, that already exists. And yes, it would be great to have a physical person saying that, but also there is a spiritual world that can also provide that. And forgive me that my description is not as eloquent as the two of yous is when I'm describing that, but hopefully you understand where I'm going with it.
There's another piece that I had in mind when John was describing the three modes and the kind of innate capacities. Also from an attachment theory and kind of evolutionary perspective, there's enough data out there to suggest that we have these natural capacities, the ability to be caring and in cooperative connection with others is a kind of natural possibility, that it doesn't need to require a bunch of effort or training to be able to do that. It's something that we come with as human beings. And then things can get in the way, different kinds of difficult experiences or traumas can interfere with those capacities. But the potential is there and we can reconnect with it. And like we describe in the book, we're trying to work with people to find what's the way that helps you, what's the most accessible way that helps you to reconnect with some simple experience. So I think it can feel kind of daunting, and I appreciate the discomfort involved, but also there is a simplicity to it, or a potential easiness to it that's also something I don't want to lose sight of.
Another facet of it too that comes up with your word, Kirsty, of discomfort. I think that discomfort comes up with reference to kind of diving deeper within. You were saying, oh, that can bring up some discomfort for many people who just will prefer to be helping people outwardly.
Mm.
But I think what that discomfort comes from is a fear of our own emotions and reactions, a fear of our own feelings. Oh, if I were to dive deep within, I'm being confronted by my own feelings. I can't handle them. I don't want to know them. But it's important to be conscious, like in our book and in our workshops or retreats, that the receptive and deepening mode in particular, the primary purpose is actually to make us into a profoundly healing environment for all of our feelings and reactions. And I often meet people in retreats and workshops that I've led or Paul has or others. I often meet people in those settings who are surprised. They didn't realize they could become a healing environment for this or that feeling, reaction, or thought that's arising. They didn't know they had it in them. But this relates back to what Paul was saying, which correlates between evolutionary psychology on the one hand, that there's kind of a capacity of warmth, care, connection, cooperation built into us. And also these foundational teachings from Buddhism, but also from other spiritual traditions, that, oh, there's an image of God in us. That's not Buddhism. Oh, there's a deep nature or ground in us, Buddha nature. Like that. Well, maybe we could learn to let that already available power of our being help us to become a much more deeply, warmly welcoming, accepting, and deeply healing environment for all of our own reactions, emotions, and feelings. And if we were to begin to discover that, oh my gosh, these ways of exploring actually are making me into that, at least for a short time, I'm actually that way. Then if you're that way with your own feelings and reactions, you are now that way also with other people. Because other people trigger your feelings and reactions. But if you're a profoundly healing environment for any reaction or feeling, you are now that also for the other person. And without the former, you can't really be that for the other person. Again, it just becomes an ideal. Or, I believe I should be there for others, but I wouldn't know how to be. I have to be there in a healing way for all of my own reactions and feelings. Then I can be that same way with others. So that's what I have to say about discomfort. It can become kind of a rationale for avoiding the possibility of becoming such a profoundly healing and grounding environment for all parts of yourself, and from there, such a secure base for others. Why would anyone reject that if they really knew that that's a real possibility for them, not just for someone else?
Well, I think that's a wonderful point for us to wrap on. I feel like we could talk and talk for hours, absolutely, on this. I Firstly, thank you both for being guests on the podcast, but I just want to encourage folks to go out there and find your book, How Compassion Works, which is out now, right? And to really just take a deeper dive for themselves. And I love, this isn't, neither of you have come on here and tried to force something onto people. That's what I love so much about your approach, is that this is open to you if you want to seek it out. And as you said, John, like that we have the capacity, and why wouldn't you want to explore this? But the option is out there. So the book will be listed in our show notes. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Kirsty.
Kirsty. Really enjoyed it.